to listen to her speech. But just to give you some short information about her. So Professor Halkier, she works as a professor in sociology, that is at the Department of Sociology at the University of Copenhagen. She obtained her PhD in social sciences from Roskilde University, and she used to work there as a professor as well in communication theory and methods. And she moved to Copenhagen a few years ago. She also has a master in political science from Aarhus University and a master of arts in contemporary sociology from Lancaster University in England. Now, her work centers around a few themes, which, and I copied this from her own site, but the sociology of everyday life, consumption, knowledge, media, and cultural sociology. And I noticed that she often uses a practice theoretical perspective, and she also writes about practice theoretical methodologies. And in her work, she often focuses on the everyday and also on the mundane. So when we asked Professor Halkier for this series, and she was very enthusiastic, but she also said that she's not a rule sociologist. Never mind, because even if she doesn't study the rule, we do think that her work is very highly relevant for rule sociology's focus. She's working on sustainable food and ethical eating, also on convenience food and the role of food and convenience food in everyday daily life. She's working on mothering and food and also on public communication around health and eating. And so all these topics, so this focus on food, on better eating, on everyday consumption, all of those fit the rule sociology group very well. And so I'm very happy that she actually accepted our invitation for today and very excited to hear her speak today. So I'll leave it up to here and I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for the kind words. Is the sound loud enough, or should I? No, that works. Okay, right. Next test, technical one, is to see whether the share screen things work, because you know how it is when you do an academic presentation. It's difficult to do it without slides, especially when you're on a webinar. You don't get to draw on blackboards and stuff like that. So here, cross your fingers for this to work. And I'll just do like this. Yes, so everybody can see the same share screen as me. Excellent, yes. Then we can begin properly. And I'd like to start with thanking so much for the invitation. I mean, I'm really honored to get this chance for dialogue with rural sociology here at Wageningen. I have been at Wageningen some years back and talking to sociologists in many of the different groups. And I'm really sorry and sad that I couldn't actually go to Wageningen physically. So, but webinars can do some other things. So, for instance, gather together people from around the world without impeding upon the climate, for instance. So, right, and for this occasion, then I decided to present some ideas about food consumption and social norms in everyday life, which is some stuff that I grapple a bit with at the moment on the side of all my other kinds of projects. And hence the title came up, Mundane Normativity and the Everyday Handling of Contested Food Consumption. And of course, I'm going to kind of define the different concepts once we go along in the presentation, but it's a paper that is work in progress, so to speak, that I'm grappling with at the moment. And I should also mention that if I sometimes have to kind of look down into my papers, it's not because I don't know what I'm going to say, but I still have some COVID-19 late stuff with lack of short-term memory plaguing my life. So I have to kind of consult my notes a little bit more than I usually used to do. I hope it passes away at some point. So, but that's why. It's not to be unpolite or because I don't know what I'm going to say, basically. It's just because sometimes I'm afraid I can't remember it. So there you are. The human side of COVID-19 and academics. So let's get on with the more interesting stuff, which is, why can't I actually move this? Now it moved, right? So you see a slide with lots of plates with food on. Excellent, good. This is the menu. What's on the menu today? I guess food is one of the common points between sociology of consumption and rural sociology. So that's my meeting point in here. So, and first I'm going to talk a little bit about what contested food consumption is and what kind of phenomenon, how it's been understood and these kinds of different things. And with contested, I just simply mean questioned or problematized, basically, on the basis of different normative public issues, which I'm going to come back to, of course. So this is the first thing on the menu. The second thing on the menu is the tendencies in the existing research on the normative dimension of consumption. And when I say even here in the menu card in the agenda, I use the word the normative dimension. I know that as sociologists, we used to call this social norms. But the symbolic interactionist critique of the functionalist theory on norms and the norm schemes and systems, etc., made many sociologists actually abandon the use of the term social norms. So you don't see it nearly as often as you did, say, 30, 35 years ago, etc. So, but just to kind of get it out in the open and demystify it, by normative, I understand that there are degrees of appropriateness of particular ways of doing something. It's not more complicated than that, if you ask me. You probably, if you ask the social philosopher, it would be much more complicated. But within everyday life kind of sociology, that's a very normal way of understanding it, so to speak. So that was the second thing on the agenda. The third thing on the agenda is to say something about why call it mundane normativity. And of course, there's a lengthy kind of argument around that. And it also kind of, this is where I start to kind of try to theorize the normative in food consumption with a starting point in a practice theoretical perspective. So I will be speaking about practice theories when we come later for it. But at a certain point in time, I will also say that the reason why I choose normativity and not something else is that it's a kind of a signal of taking processes seriously. So it's a process term, so to speak. But I'll come back to that, of course. Fourth point on the menu is then a suggestion for how to actually try to categorize or conceptualize mundane normativity in a way that can more easily be used in empirical work, empirical research. And my way of doing that is by making or stating two intertwined dimensions, what I call expectable food consumption and what I call acceptable food consumption. And then after that, the two next points of the agenda is, after I try to explain the two dimensions, to give some empirical exemplifications of both expectable and acceptable food consumption. And then this is not on the agenda really. Oh, it is on the agenda actually, or the menu. My last point would be to say a little bit about how this is work in progress and where it should lead to, hopefully, in the near future. In other words, what I would like to do that I haven't really done so much with the paper that is lying underneath this presentation. So I hope this made sense. And please, if there are any kind of clarifying questions, I don't know what the format is here. I'm fine with being interrupted, but Esther is probably the one who is kind of steering all this. And so if the policy here is that you wait with all the questions until the end, that's fine with me as well. So do you want to comment on that, Esther, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the format either, but I would say if it's just a clarifying question, then, and if you don't mind, then it would work to just shortly ask it.
Fine, yes, absolutely. Right, well, you decide. So great, yes, that was the menu. So let's get started. First, I wanted to say a little bit about explaining the contested food consumption as a phenomenon, so to speak. And so when I talk about it, it's bound into the understanding of what food consumption is at all. So food provisioning, cooking and eating in everyday life is of course embedded in all of the everyday life kind of things, in practicalities, in social relations, in activities, and also imaginations and conventions for how to do and how not to do, so to speak. So food in everyday life is related to many different aspects of how people live their daily lives. And part of this is also understandings and negotiations of what are the proper ways of, for instance, providing for meals and proper ways of eating, for instance. So, and the ideal of the family meal is actually an example in case. And here you can see on this picture is a quite blunt kind of representation of the family meal. It shows some of the elements of this ideal in many ways. A binary nuclear family, they're also white, in fact, sitting around a table at the same time and eating together and not doing something else while they're eating. They all eat the same kind of food. And the food actually looks both homemade and healthy in a certain sense. There are vegetables and there's lean meat, kind of lives up to some of the standards you see in official dietary advice, at least in Denmark. So if you kind of roll back, a lot of the everyday life food sociology studies show that, well, first of all, not all families look like this at all. Lots of non-binary, lots of divorced families, brought together families, much more multiple members, families, shifting families, etc. And of course, not to mention, of course, belonging to different social groups, which include also different kind of class groups and race groups, etc. So sitting around a table at the same time and eating together is also something that the sociology of food has shown multiple times that that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes dinner is eaten at very different points of time, even though you are a nuclear family, because somebody has to go to football and then comes back late, and somebody hasn't arrived from work yet, and all these kind of different things that makes the family end up not sitting along the same table at the same time. Also, media sociology has shown that people use a lot of media nowadays while they're eating. So it's quite unrealistic not to see any mobile phones on the table here, for instance, or that people are watching television, or that they're not necessarily sitting at a dining table, but they're actually sitting in a sofa in front of the television while eating. That the whole of the family eats the same kind of food is also not unusual. But on the other hand, you see lots of examples from research that kids get a different kind of food than the grown-ups get, for instance, in a family like this. So, and whether it's homemade or healthy, that's a quite different discussion. And of course, we see a lot of examples in the food research also that that's not necessarily, of course, the case. So the normative is already there in everyday life, even before media and social works and NGOs and state institutions and whatever start to question particular food habits. The normative is already in there. Some ideas about what's proper to do and what's not proper to do. Another thing that I would like to say is that the contestation or the questioning of different kinds of food consumption is not a new thing. If you look at historical analysis of food consumption and cooking and eating, etc., for instance, sugar consumption or working class eating routines or whatever, it shows that food habits have long been rendered a normative public issues of concern of some sorts among different kinds of societal actors. So the contestation of food consumption is definitely not a new thing historically. So if you notice on the slides, this is the first slide where it's happening, so I'm just mentioning it now. Some of the slides you see references for literature. And of course, since I guess the slides will be shared some way or another, I'm now looking at Esther, I think they probably are. That's why the references are there, so that it makes it easier to kind of pick up upon where is there an argument that is an example of what I talked about in that slide. It's not on every slide, but on the relevant slides, so to speak. So, right, contested food consumption is also related to the media development. So, due to the increased availability of public moral discourses, one might say, in today's kind of media-saturated everyday lives, this handling of normative food issues of different sorts becomes more expected in everyday life nowadays than it probably was 20, 30 years ago. So food consumption in everyday life is becoming questioned from a various array of public debates in present societies. You probably know all of them, I would guess, and can add several to the list of, say, risk, health, sustainability, quality, animal welfare, and climate. They're just some of the issues whereby food consumption is being questioned. Climate is probably one of the most prominent issues at the moment, but health is an all-time big issue, which also you can trail historically back to be something that societal actors worried about the appropriateness of people's eating in relation to whether it was healthy or not. But this cultural, ethical, and political, I'm just taking the whole broad stroke here, the cultural, ethical, and political questioning then, due to the media, becomes amplified by the media development. So the media development I'm talking about here is, of course, the one that you can also see on the picture with the mobile phone, the digitalization of all media, the cross-platform sharing, and the user-driven content on social media. So that means that most of food consumers, or at least a majority of them, are potentially getting in touch with the moral discourses of contested food consumption due to the media availability right here in the palm of the hands of consumers, basically. So that's another reason why contested food consumption is particularly interesting to look at the moment or nowadays. The last thing I wanted to say about contested food consumption is something about the context in which it takes place. So handling contestation of food consumption, when you get the consumer perspective, of course, then takes place in everyday life. So this is not to say that the handling of contestation of food consumption doesn't take place in other places as well, because of course it does. It takes place in NGOs, offices, and in the marketplace, in different firms, and in state institutions, etc. But now we're talking about the handling that takes place in everyday life. And so in that sense, the discourses of contested food consumption of different sorts are co-constructed among consumers in their social networks in everyday life. And this highlights to me that everyday life has become a site for what you might call normative action. However, food in everyday life at the same time tends to be characterized by at least the following three dynamics, other dynamics, which also form the part of shaping how contested food consumption is actually being handled in everyday life. So I'm talking about tacit embodied routines, that food is only one practice out of many, and that this is all about social identification as well. So let me say a little bit about each of them. When food is a tacit, consists a lot by tacit embodied routines. This means that food is not necessarily reflected upon nor talked about in everyday life among people. Food is a long way something that is taken for granted. What we're going to cook, what we're going to eat, how we're going to get it, who's eating where, what we're eating, etc. I think food sociologists sometimes say that most of the food eaten by most of people most of the time is the same or roughly the same within a kind of some sort of range. So the second point I wanted to highlight about everyday life is that food is, of course, only one compound practice, yes, but still only one out of many overlapping practices. So this means that when we look at what people do with food to the other kinds of practices that it's overlapping with, eating is not the only activity taking place in everyday life. And particularly eating tends to flow into a lot of other activities such as parenting, relationship upholding, the whole of the logistics and the relation between work life and private life, and all these kinds of things. So the third thing I wanted to highlight is, of course, the issue of social identification in everyday life, that food consumption is part of people's patterns of what they identify with. So they identify as different kinds of eaters, or they kind of don't identify with eating at all. There's also people like that in everyday life for whom food isn't just isn't very important, which is sometimes very difficult for food sociologists to understand. But it's quite a group actually where food doesn't really matter. It's not important. It's just a kind of a fuel to get on with things. So it's really different how this identification dimension sort of works. But these three main kind of dimensions or dynamics in everyday life in relation to food consumption are important to keep in mind when we try to analyze how people grapple with the normative stuff in relation to food consumption. So that was the in-flight, so to speak. A little bit more kind of the existing research in flight is to say a little bit about the tendencies in the existing research. And now I'm going to broaden a little bit out from food and not only talk about food, because the first existing research strand I'm going to talk about, political consumption studies, goes across sociology and psychology, marketing, cultural geography, political science, anthropology, and history, and I'm sure I've forgotten some. So it tends to have a real kind of transdisciplinary, or at least cross or multidisciplinary character. But there's lots of sociology in there as well, of course. So this is the first existing strand, research strand about the normative and consumption that I'm going to say a little bit about, the political consumption studies. In the political consumption studies, there's a focus on explicit, what you might call either ethical or political action. So, and this intentional action is according to goals about, for instance, climate, sustainability, human rights, whatever it is, animal rights, health, safety. So in order to kind of try intentionally to act in order to influence markets and to influence market regulation, for instance. And there's also a big focus, of course, on who are the political consumers, what kind of group are we dealing with here, what's their, not just their motivations, which is on the slide, but also to a large degree their social background, etc. So whom are we speaking with here and speaking about? So this entire strand of existing research is very, very useful for mapping and for investigating consumer groups and segments, and for mapping and investigating consumption patterns with this particular drive of explicitly trying to do something ethical or political, however you define it, and how this kind of consumption interplays with other consumer policy actors and conditions. So when I'm now in a second criticizing this strand for lacking a specific thing, it's not as if I criticize the entire strand. It's a very useful type of research we find here. But there is a tendency to kind of, when you focus on the more explicit and the more intentional action, so to speak, that you overlook the more routinized and less explicit handlings of normative issues in everyday life. So the two references on this slide, for instance, are examples that I tend to place in this strand. So there are lots and lots of them, of course. The other existing research strand that I wanted to mention and to talk about here, about the normative in consumption, and here we narrow back to food again, or food only, and talk about food routines in everyday life. So this is where you see food consumption as an aspect of carrying out practices in everyday life. So the focus is very often, and Esther got it spot on. It's a lot of this research is inspired by different versions of practice theories or practice theoretical perspectives, of course. And here the focus is on the organization, how food practices are actually organized, what goes into this, and also the performance, how they're carried out, the food provisioning or procurement, cooking and eating. And of course, that includes some elements about conventions or conventionality. So it includes in some ways the normative. And where was I in what I wanted to say? Yeah, so that means that it can include normative processes, definitely. Nothing to say that it can't. It also tends to focus on how do various kinds of food consumption take place. So it's very much geared into looking at an analysis of the actual practices, so to speak. Now, this kind of research strand is also very helpful. It's very helpful in providing knowledge about the mundane dynamics of food consumption, which was the one that I said tended to be missing from the first strand of existing research, the political consumption. So they're kind of mirrors to each other in some ways, the two existing strands. But there's also something that this strand tends to perhaps not overlook, but just underplay, you might say. So because in a lot of practice theoretical research on, or practice theoretically inspired research in the food in everyday life area, there tends to be an insistence on how routinized food is. That tends to lead to not paying sufficient attention to the normative in food consumption, because then the normative tends to disappear into the tacit, so to speak. So that's the other side of the mirror, so to speak, that when you are very much focusing on the routinized and insisting that this is the most important characteristic of food in everyday life, then you tend to perhaps underplay the more reflected, the more normative, etc. So it is at the moment debated among researchers drawing upon practice theories how much practices can actually be said to be routinized or not. But I'm going to come back to this at the very end of the presentation, where I say something about the work in progress bricks that needs to be laid as well here in the future for this presentation or for this paper behind the presentation. So this presentation of mine today places itself in the wake of these debates among the researchers drawing upon practice theories as to how much practices can be said to be routinized. This is perhaps the most theoretical slide of them all. So don't worry, it doesn't get any worse than this. And this is, of course, my attempt to theorize differently about normative orientations in food consumption. So this is the argument for why looking at something to call mundane normativity at all. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create or work with a kind of I don't know whether this is the right word. I'm sure people from the UK would probably say that this doesn't exist, Bente, in proper English. A conceptual middle ground between the routinized and the politicized, so that you try to take the best out of, or at least parts of each of the existing strands, and kind of give the due to that it's important with the routinized, but it's also important with the politicized when you're dealing with contested food consumption. So that's maybe how I would try to explain what a conceptual middle ground might be, although it should probably be called something else. So why call it, oh no, I wanted to say actually, some people always ask me, why don't you just call it political consumption? What is all this about politicized? And I say politicized rather than political on purpose, in order to focus more on the handling, the processes in the normative, the way in which normative orientations are handled, because that's much broader than political consumption, where you actually choose to do something particular and intentionally reflect upon it and argue for it. So handling of of politicized food consumption doesn't have to be very necessarily reflective or anything. It can indeed be very mundane and routinized in some ways. So, right. So using the word normativity is in order to signal a focus on processes. So using the word mundane is rather obvious. It's about what goes on in everyday life, but normativity is perhaps a bit of a stumble block. So the reason why I talk about normativity and not normative action or norms is that I want to signal this is about processes and about the plasticity, indeed, of different intertwined things in everyday life. And so if I use the word normative action, for instance, it would be, I think, interpreted as if I was talking about almost about political consumption, so about intentional action of some sorts. It depends, of course, upon how you interpret the word action as a term in sociology, which is a long debate as well, but in order not to be misunderstood in that direction. And I also didn't want to be misunderstood in the kind of more structural directions of speaking about norms, because there are these huge old debates about whether you can use the term of norm at all in sociology or not. So that's a long explanation of why mundane normativity. So the starting point for thinking about mundane normativity is, not surprisingly then, a practice theoretical perspective. And why that, apart from the fact that I've been working with that for a number of years, so that's always the easy choice, right? But there are also some arguments, you might say. Practice theories are particularly strong at describing and interpreting microprocesses in mundane practice, basically, because the analytical unit is the practices themselves combined with the accomplishment of practice. How do people actually perform that practice? So the strength of this approach lies in its focus on patterns of everyday routines, of the material objects and infrastructures that uphold them, of the meanings and competences they involve, and the know-how of what is considered appropriate ways of carrying out everyday activities. So bearing that in mind, I think there are at least 3 points from practice theory that I kind of carry into my own conceptualization of mundane normativity. And in order to illustrate, I will just take a hypothetical example with reducing meat eating or eating more plant-based, because that's one of the current projects I'm doing now, but we don't have the data analyzed yet, so I can't show you any examples from this. But I can use some thought up examples to illustrate these 3 points coming out of practice theories that I think are important in order to use such a terminology of mundane normativity. So the first point is that food practices, and therefore the food consumption that is embedded in the practices, are recursively done, and they're redone, and they're slightly differently done. So what we're talking about with food consumption here is that there are a lot of contextual or situational adaptation and negotiation. So that means there's also a variety of ways of including whatever normative orientations we're talking about. So if we're talking about a normative orientation of reducing your meat consumption or eating more plant-based, which usually follow each other, there will be a variety of ways of actually doing this, also of including it in a normative manner, which is some of the things that we can see in our data that hasn't been finally analyzed yet, but are on their way. So in that sense, it's not only about becoming a vegetarian or a vegan, but there are lots of hybrid kind of ways of handling this meat reduction, plant-based eating issue in everyday life. So that was the first point I think we can get out of a practice theoretical perspective. The second point that I think we can get out of a practice theoretical perspective is that food activities are overlapping with a multiplicity of other practices, what I talked about earlier, actually. But this characteristic of the overlapping with many other practices then shows that the other practices also have each of their kind of notions of what's a proper performance here or appropriate performance. So you get different kinds of normative assumptions clashing or cooperating sometimes between food and other kinds of practices. So the different normative orientations from the different practices can compete with or support each other. For instance, if you look at the picture here with a lovely cake, that can definitely be a clash between different practices. You have we want to love each other here in this family and have a happy afternoon on a Sunday together, so we'll have this lovely cake. Part of a family or parenting practice might clash with the we want to live healthier kind of practice. If you look at how the cake looks, it's only the strawberry that looks slightly healthy on the picture here. So the different practices, because they have different normative orientations, they can compete with each other, which is what we see most of the time sometimes, but they can also support each other. We also see that. So it's not necessarily an either or, and that is to be unfolded empirically, I think, in every concrete area, basically. But the important stuff here is to realize that food activities do overlap with other activities, and therefore food normative questions also overlap with other kinds of normative questions, which they might compete with and they might help each other, but that's something that we can only see empirically. So, and the third thing I thought we could kind of learn from or get out of having a practice theoretical perspective is that the normative is already sort of addressed in some of the practice theoretical writings, and as conventions usually. So if you look in Alan Ward's book about eating as a practice, or the practice of eating, I think it's called, he there kind of defines conventions, so the normative, as guidelines, which then covers, luckily for me, I think, both skillfulness on the one hand and legitimacy on the other hand. So because guidelines can both be how to do things the right way, so to speak, in a more practical manner, but it can also be about the normative regulation, that some ways of doing the food thing are considered more appropriate than others. So I think this starting point in his looking at conventions as perhaps guidelines suggests that conventions suggesting that conventions are guidelines in Alan Ward point to negotiations, not seeing the normative dimension as on the one hand stable internalized rules, as an old-fashioned kind of concept of sociological norms would do, but neither does it see the normative dimension of consumption as kind of, very unstable, situationally dependent, but rather something contingent element in between, an element of the social sharedness of practicing something. So it's not on the one hand structuralized in a very steady manner, stable manner. On the other hand, it's not completely unstructured and completely unpredictable, so to speak. So that was part of what drew me towards Alan Ward's conceptualization of this. So this was the most hairy part of the presentation, I think. If there are not any clarifying questions, I can go on to actually show the more kind of close to research dimensions and exemplify them empirically. Esther, have you received any kind of clarifying questions? No. Okay, right. So I try to kind of operationalize, you might say, the mundane normativity by two probably overlapping dimensions of mundane normativity. And why do I say probably overlapping? Well, that's because I presented in a very short form this argument at a departmental seminar last week. And one of the comments I got was, Bente, these two dimensions, don't they overlap some? Probably. I'll have to deal with this. This is part of the work in progress, I suppose. So, but here comes the two suggestions. So the suggestion for the first dimension of mundane normativity is to see it as expectable food consumption. So what's expectable food consumption? Well, that's what is socially expected in relation to particular food performances and particular food situations, and to which degree, you might say. What is being expected socially often relies on the extent and the regularity of how people actually meet particular ways of doing food in their everyday life. For instance, how often and in which ways will you see fellow consumers eating a plant-based meal, for instance? If that's a very rare thing, it's not necessarily something that you will expect. Whereas if it's something you see all the time and you see your own family among your colleagues, etc., it's probably more expected, so to speak. So the expectable often relies on this extent and regularity of meeting this kind of performance. In this sense, the dimension of expectable is in family with one of the elements Alan Ward uses in his definition of practices, namely the procedures. How do people do it? So, and another parallel, now we're sociologists around this presentation here, is a parallel to the normalization research done by mainly with a starting point in symbolic interactionism among sociologists, where people are interested as researchers in the reproduction and change of consumption and how this is considered more or less normal or more or less problematic. by different groups and in different contexts, etc. So that's the parallel kind of concept you might, if you come from a different sociological background, you might want to kind of hook up with in relation to this dimension, the first dimension, expectable food consumption. The second dimension in mundane normativity, as I suggested, is what you might call acceptable food consumption. And now this is slightly different than the expectable, and it's different in the sense that this is not about regularity and extent of meeting, etc. This is about the strength of the legitimacy of particular ways of doing something, of provisioning for food, meals, for cooking and for eating, etc. So, for instance, again, coming back to the thought up example with the plant-based foods, serving a plant-based meal might be the only appropriate thing to do in one context and might be completely unacceptable in other contexts. So, for instance, if you are among a bunch of PC scholars where over 50% of them are vegetarians, for instance, or vegans, then your dinner out with them in the city is bound to kind of contain serving of plant-based meals. Otherwise, that would be totally inappropriate, because you would not be catering for people's way of eating, basically. So, and on the other hand, at a family party with lots of people from the older generation who've grown up with meat eating a lot, Denmark, the Danish food culture is a very meat-heavy culture. I'd say it might be completely unacceptable not to serve at least some meat and go completely with plant-based meals. So what we're talking about here with acceptable food consumption, again, is not stable conventions or norms, but rather negotiations of acceptability, you might say, based on people's engagement in food practices. And so here again, this is linked to one of the elements in Alan Ward's definitions of practices, namely engagements, which is emotional and normative orientations in a particular practice. So, so this is the negotiations based on people's engagements or kind of very low engagement, perhaps, in something. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a high engagement. It kind of covers the whole of the continuum, so to speak. And if, again, as sociologists, you sit and kind of search for a parallel to other parts of sociology, I would say that one possible parallel might be to the whole French pragmatic sociology wave of justification and engagement. So, you know, the orders of worth, theories of convention, whatever people call Boltanski and Thibodeau, because this is about different repertoires of legitimating activities in any kind of context, which all types of social actors can draw upon, and might also be used in acceptable food consumption negotiations. So, right, and now I'm on to exemplifying the two dimensions here in mundane normativity, the expectable and the acceptable food consumption, by way of exemplifying it from empirical studies and not the hypothetical or half hypothetical example of plant-based eating. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, because you can also go back to it once the slides are being shared. But just to kind of clarify that I'm talking about examples from 4 different studies, and this is to show the broadness of the usability of the terms, basically. It's not to be slobby. I mean, I could have also just taken one study, but I think that's less interesting in some ways. If you can show that some concepts work in 4 different or 6 different research projects, I think it has a better kind of strength, so to speak, as an argument. So that's why you will see examples from the 4 different projects here. They're all done on the basis of different kinds of qualitative methods, and they all deal with some sort of contested food consumption. Cooking from scratch, homemade meals is the public issue, so to speak, or the contended issue in the first project. The second one is about health. The third one is about convenience food. And in some ways, the use of meal box schemes is also about convenience food, but I'll come back to that and spare you a long explanation and go straight to the empirical examples. And I'll begin with expectable food consumption as the dimension, and in order to follow the order, so to speak, from before. So the first two little quotes on this slide are examples from the project with the young people and convenience food. And the first quote from Johnny, all the names are anonymous, of course, or they're not called that, pseudonyms, sorry. So Johnny is not really Johnny, he's somebody else. But the first quote really shows how Johnny has a quite strong expectation for other young people. So people from his own kind of target group or home group or identity group or whatever, to actually use convenience food. And so he says, I tend to think that everybody does it. You know, if somebody said they didn't, my first thought would be that they're lying. You know, it just seems to have become part of your, that it's not a wrong thing to do. It's just very natural. And so it's funny because there's an awareness in this quote about how convenience food could be seen as a wrong thing to do. But this is overruled by the naturalness that he then uses to describe the social expectation that is actually being expressed here. So just to quote one of the young women from this project as well, she says something else, but which is also something about the expectation towards representations of what you might call correct, healthy food habits on social media, and thus avoiding a representation of the use of or the consumption of convenience food. Nuna says, I think that sometimes you should be careful about not to, expose yourself all the time on Facebook or Instagram like a health freak, I think. I don't know, but yeah, sometimes you could really say, come on, really, come on, you did eat a pizza yesterday, So in this sense, this young woman expresses a parallel high expectation level for young people to actually eat convenience food, as the young man quoted about, as a part of her critique of other young people for not admitting to it, but by framing their food habits differently on social media. And all this is, of course, because convenience food is a normative public issue in the debates also in Denmark, where it's kind of continuously, there's a worry among other kind of social actors about that young people can't cook and they won't cook and they live from convenience food and they will be undernourished and it's terrible that they don't carry the cooking culture on and all these kinds of things. So convenience food has this ring of not being very legitimate, so to speak. The last example on expectable food consumption I want to share with you comes from another project, which is a project about food habits and health, healthier food among Pakistani Danes. And so healthier food guidelines have become a competitive normative area in Denmark with a multitude of different regimes of healthier eating available. That's probably the case in all of the countries that you represent around this presentation of this webinar. So what follows here is an extract from a family interview with a married couple where they explain how they cook dinner, and something interesting happens in the end. So Mustafa, the husband, explains fresh garlic, right? We press garlic and put on top. Takes 2 to 3 hours with a marinade, then it lies in the fridge, and then afterwards becomes a healthy food that we roast in the pan. Yes, yes, says the interviewer. And Mustafa then says, we put very little in, 2 dinner spoons or 1 dinner spoon maximum 2 dinner spoons of oil in the pan. The crucial word here is oil, and also spoons. Then his wife, Aisha, says, I think you probably mean teaspoon. And Mustafa immediately says, yes, teaspoons. So what happens, or what seems to be happening here at least, is that Mustafa's wife expects perhaps that the interviewer socially expects healthier cooking procedures, because that's part of what we interviewed them about. And then when she's not satisfied with the amount of oil that her husband accounts for using for the dinner, she corrects him into talking about less oil. When he this he appropriates immediately. So not only is healthier cooking procedures socially expected, but it's also the conversation about them that is highly socially regulated, so to speak. Finally, there are the empirical examples of acceptable food consumption, only 2 examples here. And the first one comes from the research project about Danish female subscribers to a lifestyle magazine. And so cooking meals from scratch is often seen as a counter category to convenience food. So the goodie kind of thing to do. And cooking homemade meals are understood as a labor of love done for family and friends. Sociology has shown that many times. So in the following extract, it comes from an interview with one of the women in their 30s, and she tells a story about the lack of acceptable cooking for the Christmas dinner in her parents' home. So Tia says, we were over there for Christmas, and she, the mother, she had bought ready-made rice porridge in one of those plastic bags, right, to make the risalamande. I do have to make a footnote here. Risalamande is the traditional Christmas pudding in the Danish Christmas. So, and it's made by cold rice porridge mixed with vanilla, chopped almonds, and cream. It may sound horrible to those who are not used to it, but it's actually quite delicious. And so this is what she sees. She sees the plastic bags of ready-made kind of rice porridge lying in the fridge. And it was really like this. When I opened the fridge, they were just lying there. And I was just like, okay, we're going to have a good Christmas. I'm not going to make a scene. And then I just went out to my partner, Emil, and said, do you know what's in the fridge? And then she laughs. And she, the mother, obviously doesn't bother to make porridge. It didn't taste too good either. That was really a bit of a miss. Not stirred with love. Ouch, mum. Not stirred with love. That's probably one of the worst things you can say to somebody responsible for the cooking. So here, cooking the Christmas dinner dessert from scratch is very clearly seen as the acceptable thing to do. And when not done, it is seen as a breach on what should be accepted in the holiday context of meals. However, the narrative also contains a normative compromise in the sense that Tia actually does not openly confront her mother with her disappointment, but keeps it to herself and her partner in order to live up to another social acceptability, avoid conflicts at Christmas time when the whole family is together. So that shows the connections between the different acceptabilities related to different kinds of practices. The second example comes from the last project, which was a research project on food habits, convenience, food consumption, and sustainability in 4 European countries. And the Danish case work was looking at meal box subscribers. So meal boxes, I guess, is a well-known phenomenon. It's a kind of a system where you pre-order a bag or a box where the entire meals for say 2 or 3 or 4 days are kind of, you get all the ingredients pre-weighed and measured and all that, and you get a step-by-step recipe to do it. So when it lands on your doorstep, so to speak, all you have to do is unpack it, and then you can cook everything. But you don't have to plan it, and you don't have to look at what you use. Everything is being served for you in that sense. So this is what they're talking about in this extract. It's an extract from focus groups with subscribers to mealbox schemes, where they negotiate the acceptable amount of meat in evening meals. And so one of the women begins the ball by saying, and there I also wrote that there wasn't sufficient meat. Another footnote. One of the things that people complain most about to the mealbox suppliers is that there's not enough meat in the boxes, which is interesting because these particular boxes that we're talking about here are actually all organic boxes, and they're from a company who kind of advertises that they try to live up to the 80-20 distribution between plants and meat. So, but still the biggest complaint here is about there's not sufficient meat in the box. So this is what Gro starts by saying, yes, I wrote to them saying there wasn't sufficient meat. This is what it means. Then one of the men says, I actually experienced that I economized with my meat. I remember I sat there and made that tiny lump of meat stretch all the way, just like when you're only allowed to drink 1 glass of red wine, then you can actually easily manage it anyway. And that was how it was with that meat. And then you do eat extraordinarily more green than otherwise. And Karen, one of the other women, says, yes, I like it. And Bent again says, yay. But I also think it's really fine. My stomach liked it too. Yes, says Karen, but I think it's good. Then Martin, one of the other men, says, but it is. And it's what they say you should. You know, eat less meat. But I'm just not there. It's not that I'm a meat boy, but I just want to feel full. And then Group comes back and says, "You are a meat boy." And actually all of them laughs after this. So what happens here is that the subscribers cannot themselves decide the amount of meat in the boxes. So the participants tend to agree upon the socially acceptable in eating less meat, also because they've chosen it. But some of them, like Martin, also question it on the basis of other acceptable food experiences, such as satiety. Another way you can see the negotiation of the acceptable is through Martin's use of a humorous nickname, Meat Boy, an expression of how he does not want to be positioned with other meat eaters, but Group positions him there anyway, in spite of his efforts to actually legitimize his meat eating in other ways. So I didn't know the expression, the meat boy, before I conducted this focus group, in fact. So it's out there as an interesting everyday life kind of a terminology, apparently. Wonder whether it's like that in other countries. So the last thing I wanted to say is to say a little bit about the work in progress, and I'll keep it very short because I can see I've been spending more than the time I've actually been allotted, I think. So just to kind of take a brief look to the future, what's missing? What is it I would like to do more with this? And so first of all, there are 2 points really. The first is that sociology of consumption within the practice theoretical perspective tended to distinguish itself as a kind of a corrective and alternative to what was called the cultural term in consumption scholarship. And this meant that a number of concepts and issues were thrown out as babies with the bathwater, I'll say. For instance, material semiotic approaches, moral economy, social interaction, reflexivity, and the normative, in fact, as well. So, but that's why there's an attempt among practice theories inspired sociologists in consumption to kind of reappraise the cultural dynamics in consumption without losing the more kind of routinized or habitual aspect or perspective of everyday life. And if you see the first of the 2 references, the Welsh et al. From 2020, that's an introductory article to a special issue of cultural sociology, which was all about this attempt to reappraise the cultural in consumption within the practice theories. The second way in which this is work in progress is that I tend to see from my data and from other people's data that there's a lot of social hierarchy taking place also in mundane normativity. And that hierarchy stuff is not sufficiently addressed by researchers inspired by practice theories. This, I think, is probably due to, for instance, a tendency to talk about how practice theories are having a flat ontology. But however, there are many different parts of practicing something that can be seen particularly to express at least potential hierarchical regulation of how these activities are performed. Some things are better to do than other things. So I think we need to try to tackle this social hierarchy thing. And this is, of course, because also practicing food takes place in a broader culture with, for example, discourses on healthy lifestyle and good parenting and what not do we have. So in the second reference, me and a good colleague, Lotte Holm, try to grapple with this and to conceptualize a little bit in the end about social hierarchy and how this can be worked into a context of looking at healthier food consumption among people with low education and low income, because they are particularly prone to being kind of hit by the discourses of social hierarchy in relation to their food habits and health. So, but that's not finalized either. So that's also work in progress in a sense. So that's what's to come in the future, I think. So that was all. Thank you very much for listening so patiently, or whatever you have been doing behind your screens.
Thanks a lot, Bente. That was that was very inspiring. And there's lots of stuff going on in my head also about some of the work I'm still working on, where your perspective could actually be very useful. So thanks a lot again. I have a few things to say. Because a few years back, I was doing my PhD research and I sort of fell in love with practice theory. So I was very happy to see this come back here, which I knew, of course, before. And I really like this view that you presented on mundane normativity. And it sort of reminded me of an earlier paper that you wrote, and I use that in teaching. And you write there on routinized ethical behavior. I think it's from 2012 or 2009. You make a distinction there between environmentally friendly consumption as a practice and the environmentally friendly consumption as part of wider practices. And so it sort of reminded me of what you were doing here, because you were also trying already to look for that middle ground. Anyway, I have two questions before going to the rest of the audience. One just for clarification, and another one, because what wasn't, I'll start with the shorter one, what wasn't completely clear to me, you talk about this expectable and acceptable, and it wasn't clear to me how they relate, or do you put, is one stricter than the other, or maybe you haven't thought about that, but what's their relation?
That's a really good question. I'm not finished thinking about that. I think the first thing I wanted to say was what I mentioned before also, that I think they're definitely overlapping in the sense that people, consumers, will deal differently with the acceptable depending upon how expectable a particular kind of contested food consumption is in their own kind of networks and their own everyday life. So in that sense, they're definitely in some ways overlapping or dependable upon each other. And I wouldn't necessarily say that one of them is more strict than the other one. I think it's not, again, not to say that everything's up for grabs and everything is just situational, because I think we get nowhere by saying that. So as sociologists, sorry, if somebody is very situationist out there, I think it makes it very difficult if you have a very situationist approach to things. Then it becomes really difficult to actually say something about what kind of patterns you see if you want to say that everything is really unique adaptations in the situation, etc. So that's also part of trying to find the middle ground, so to speak. But I don't think necessarily that the expected or the acceptable, one of them is more strict than the other ones. The other one, I guess the expectable can be more silent, more tacit than the acceptability will sometimes, I guess, will be more in some ways talkative, so to speak, more explicit in some ways. So
yeah. All right. So thanks for that. And then if I can, I would like to ask a second question, but maybe in the meantime, people can also write questions in the chat. I see one question already came in. So, so I was wondering, because you talk about this middle ground, obviously. But when, in my reading also about better food systems, there's often this discussion about whether individuals should make better choices. Of course, I know this relates to the practice theoretical positioning, and those who argue that the environment should create better options so that choices are maybe, between the environment and the individual, of course. So I wonder, how does mundane normativity fit in there? Or maybe how do we foster that mundane normativity to come about? Or I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yes. Also because that's what I'm doing a lot of presentations precisely about this, because I'm a member of the National Climate Council in Denmark, and so I sit there as a kind of a behavior expert. I never used the word behavior before I entered that council 1 year ago. I used to say everyday life practice, and habits and stuff like that. But there, in relation to this, I think there's a unique opportunity actually to use mundane normativity, or the kind of the perspective of mundane normativity, to push for some changes as well. Because if you look at the or what's the word in English, the different strategies you can choose in order to change how people consume in everyday life. There's of course the individual, right? You can enlighten people with campaigns, you can try to steer them with taxes, etc. But they all miss out on something, and they're not necessary. I mean, prices obviously do something, but campaigns have been shown to be not working very well, or not creating the results that NGOs and politicians hoped for. And so there's the kind of the more individual model for trying to change what goes on in everyday life. And then of course there's just the kind of more institutional one, that you pass laws, you make guidelines for how to consume and how to produce, by the way, and for infrastructures and technologies, etc. And then there's the third kind of model, or what you might call it, which is based on looking at changes of behavior, or changes of habits from a practice theoretical perspective, or at least from a kind of a social practice broader point of view. And what runs things there is that it should become more easy, first of all, and secondly, more normal for people to do something else than they usually do. So at the moment, I'm actually trying to teach the Danish Climate Council, which consists of economists mostly, to say the word normalization. Because you need, in that sense, I would argue that you will need collaboration between public institutions and private firms and private organizations in order to create better frame conditions, so to speak, for consumers to actually make other choices, to do something different than they used to do. And that implies both it being more easy, but also that it becomes more normal. So supporting the normalization of changed behavior, so to speak, is one of the things that you can get out of such a mundane normativity, practice theoretically inspired perspective on food, in the debate about the individual versus the environment, so to speak. A lot of politicians will just say, "Oh, it's the choice of the individual consumers." It's like, no, it's not always choices. Remember that. If you don't remember anything else I've said, please remember that it's not only choices and not only individual.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That was very helpful. Leo had a question, Leo. It actually came in already a while ago. I don't know if you still want to ask, Leo, but he asked, do you look into what good food means from the normative perspective in food practices?
Can I just get it again? Sorry.
Yes. Maybe you can also, I don't know if you want to explain it further, Leo, but it says, do you look into what good food means from the normative perspective in food practices?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's what I do all the time, so to speak. But I look into it from people in everyday life's perspective. So I think in everything I'm writing, I always have this kind of sentence or two saying, yes, there's this debate about what sustainable is, or yes, there's this debate about what healthy food is, etc. And now we're going to look at what people in everyday life see as healthier or see as more sustainable, knowing that there are all these definitions that this might not live up to, so to speak. So in that sense, I mean, it's impossible to look at the normative negotiations of procuring of meals and cooking and eating without people talking about what they see as good food, and especially also what they see as bad food. So
yeah, I guess that answers your question, Leo. Yeah, he does say thank you and excellent. Are there any more questions from the audience?
I'd like to ask a question if I can. Yeah. Thanks, Bente. A really interesting presentation. I'm not a practice theorist, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the connection to the political, and I'm particularly also thinking about the role or the politicization of particular foods. So I don't know, hummus and claims around who owns hummus, or Jane Scott's work around the sort of grain as a political crop. I'm just wondering how that might work into your work. And I was wondering in particular in that sort of Danish Pakistani project, was there a sense that Pakistani Danes are performing a political act when they choose to eat certain foods in Denmark that Danes might not choose to eat? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that was a question with many dimensions into it. but I'll remember to do the very concrete Pakistani Dane dimension in the end of my attempt to answer that. But yes, that's one of the things that practice theories grapple with really seriously, is to connect to what other people might say are meso levels and macro levels. So that kind of covers, perhaps for some people, the political system and the market system as well, in many ways, and everything in between there. So some of the more, I think, useful ways of doing it I've seen in articles come from, for instance, somebody like Tom Hargreaves from the UK, where he tries to connect practice theories on also, I think one of the two examples he uses is actually food. And he tries to connect that with what is called multi-level theory. That doesn't tell anything until you look at what it is. It's a really kind of non-word for a theory, very strange. But the point about this multi-level theory is that it's about different niches and arenas and networks and projects in the kind of among the food market, or at least among market actors and regulatory actors. So it tends to then include other kind of actors than will usually be kind of represented in people's work with practice theories. So it enlarges, so to speak, what the perspectives can do something with by combining the two. And there are other examples of people combining with other kinds of theories, but that's usually the strategy, because nobody has yet come to kind of say, oh, this is how we can lift practice theory up to the macro level, because nobody really dares to do that. But Daniel Welsh, who is on the last slide, is one of the co-authors and co-editors of the special issue for cultural sociology. He actually is working on an attempt to do this. So other people have also tried to combine practice theoretical perspective with Polanyi's, for instance, concepts from moral economy, etc., which could also be brought up to kind of including different kind of organized actors and a more macro level, so to speak. And I believe that's one of Daniel Welsh's kind of ambitions. That's part of what he's thinking about doing. So, and is grappling with. So, and then there was the Pakistani. Yes, whether they kind of owned their own food or they felt politicized, so to speak. And there was this, the empirical results showed that that the Pakistani Danes understood themselves as eating wonderful food, much better, not as boring as the Danish food. But on the other hand, they had an understanding of, but sometimes there's too much oil in there. So at parties, for instance, you would see them scraping off the oil in a discreet manner with napkins and stuff and put away in order to get less oil, etc. And then on the other hand, they would look at their own food as being really nice food, but with a tendency perhaps to be less healthy at least on the dimension of oil and sugar, whereas they would look at the Danish, what they understood as Danish food, as being really boring and not having any taste at all, which is true for some very traditional Danish food indeed. But at least more healthy in the sense that some of it is steamed or boiled and not kind of cooked to pieces in lots of oil, etc. The funny thing is that none of Pakistani Danes actually mentioned that a lot of their dishes actually contain a higher degree of plant-based stuff. And they have many more vegetarian dishes than the traditional Danish food does. But this is also part of Danish food being seen as, that's also spaghetti bolognese, for instance. And all sorts of, more generalized kind of food categories. So, and burgers and pizza, etc. That would be seen as Danish food. And then we add our own spices. So it's nicer to eat. was one of the often heard comments, so to speak. I don't know whether that answered your question. So.
Thanks. In the meantime, two more questions came in the chat. I missed one of them at first, but I think we have time to do both of them. Lucy Sovova, she asked, well, she said first, thanks for the great talk. And then she said, I'm really curious about the relation between the expectable and the acceptable. And just as I typed this, it was asked. But then she said, but perhaps how would the two relate to how practices change over time?
Yes, they would, in fact. So thank you for that question. Because in some ways you might think that there would have to be a certain amount of expectability, so to speak, over time developed before people will start grappling with how acceptable something is. Because if it's something almost completely unknown or not taking place, it maybe wouldn't either come up as a kind of a more normative, acceptable or not so acceptable thing to do or not to do in your own everyday life, so to speak, unless you hear about it in the media, of course. I mean, the good case here is really plant-based eating, because I mean, in Denmark, we've had vegetarians and vegans for years and years, but it hasn't really been a topic of conversation, so to speak, and negotiation and what do you do for big family parties, but it is now. We can see that from some of our latest data, also quantitative data, that people kind of, I think it was around 40% from a representative sample of Danes answered that they did talk to somebody about this, and that would have been like what, 10% perhaps just 10 years ago. So in that sense, the expectable dimension have become more strong in Denmark, and it has all, and that I think releases more discussions and negotiations about what's acceptable then, because you bump into it more. So handling stuff in everyday life is a lot about what you bump into, because everyday life is not necessarily very strategic or very planned or anything, but you bump into stuff and then we need to handle this kind of thing. So the more you bump into it, the more the need to handle it becomes obvious, so to speak. I don't know whether that was anything of use or...
I think it answered the question. Oh, she says, thank you. That was indeed what I was thinking, that seeing something a lot actually eventually makes it acceptable. And in fact, we did students of ours did a study in Wageningen where they spoke to students who were vegetarian in a non-vegetarian household and the other way around.
Yes,
and of
interesting.
course, yeah, it was interesting. And of course, Wageningen is a very specific bubble, but we did notice that for all of the non-vegetarians, non-vegetarians, it had become completely acceptable to eat vegetarian for their vegetarian roommates. And yeah, well, anyway, we haven't really looked into the data much, but we have seen that had become completely acceptable and even acceptable, I would say.
Yes, yeah.
One final question, I think, was from Lani Trenuth, if I pronounced that right. And she asked, have you engaged with the academic literature on alternative food networks? And if so, what are your thoughts around the utility or lack thereof of this term itself? And is there a better way to frame and name these practices that are often put under the umbrella of alternative food networks? My issue is that alternative is relational and the conventional changes according to place and time. Yet the academic literature seems to conceptualize AFNs as alternative to something static and pervasive everywhere for all people at all times.
Yeah.
Did you get that? Because it was very long.
Yes, I hope so, or guess so. Yes, in the sense that the alternative food networks literature covers something with is it called CSA, and all these kind of different. We have these kind of cooperatives in Denmark as well, where you get together in the Copenhagen food company, for instance, and then you can pick up stuff every week or whatever it is, and there's a closer relation to the farming, the farmer, or something like that. So yes, absolutely. And I myself have been a bit weary with the kind of sticking to the term alternative, because this exactly can be a part of kind of hampering the change towards something becoming more normal in a sense. So it's the same with the existing literature on changing into plant-based eating. And there's a whole lot of literature on the individual, motivational, etc. Stuff on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a whole big literature on vegans and vegetarians, and nothing in between, almost. I'm overstating it, of course, but that means that you get focused on the kind of the identity endpoint rather than on the processes. And in that sense, if you only have your eyes on the kind of endpoint, identity endpoint with vegetarianism and veganism, that almost comes to play the same, in some ways, unlucky role as the word alternative, because then do people want to identify with this? Maybe not, but a large part of people might want to identify with getting into process of cutting down meat, but don't want to identify as being vegans or being vegetarians. And it's the same with alternative food networks. Maybe people don't want to identify with being alternative. Maybe they want to be part of a trend towards something becoming more normal. And that's these piecemeal kinds of processes towards change captures the shifts much better, in my opinion, than putting up something as conventional, and this is how it is, and alternative over here. And then you shift overnight almost, or over a week. And that's not how change of food habits happen. So that's one of the things that we hope we will show. I know we're going to show with this newer project on the shifts to plant-based meals. So in that project, there's a qualitative part with a PhD scholar who's been doing interviews and mobile diaries, and also is doing focus groups and stuff, speaking to people who are in the course of changing, who are in the process of changing their eating habits towards less meat, but can be in all sorts of stages. So it can be somebody who just started just cutting out a little bit of meat in the one end, and in the other end, somebody who's been a vegan for 5 years. So we try to focus on the processes there. And then there's a quantitative part with a representative sample of Danes, where we can show that the proportion of vegans and vegetarians, very small in Denmark, is 5% taken together. But there's a 25% group of people who identify as flexitarians, who are cutting down meat and are trying to be in process. And then there's all sorts of other, of course, results in there. But we also want to look, Esther, at the networks, actually, and the way in which networks and different network relations kind of influence where people stay on their kind of course of change, so to speak. So that's going to be the next article, we hope, after we've handed in the first one. So
thanks a lot. That was very clarifying. And Lani, maybe you can react. Yeah, great. Thank you, she says. So thanks a lot. That's been very helpful. We're out of time. So I think, Mark, I'm just going to give the floor to you, because we've also, well, not we, Bente has answered all the questions that were here. So I guess I just give the floor to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to really sincerely thank you, Bente, for joining us and for your time today, and a really fascinating, stimulating, and really interesting presentation and discussion afterwards as well. And also a great way for us to kick off the new academic year as well, and get us back into get our intellectual juices flowing as well. So thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure to join here. So thank you very much. And thanks for the good questions and nice comments. So yeah. And
also thanks very much to Esther for moderating today. Esther recently, sadly for us, left RSO to take up a new position, but we're very happy to have you back today, joining us today. So thanks very much, Esther. So that's it. A recording of this presentation will appear on our playlist on YouTube, and you can view it there along with 3 other really interesting and stimulating seminars. And then also please keep an eye out for our next upcoming seminar in this series, which will be towards the end of the year. So thank you once again to Bente Halkier for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all and have a great evening. I think, Lizette, it's up to you to close the session. Thank you.